Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a calm, thoughtful, and academic approach to a really fundamental issue in systems engineering. We're looking at exactly why benchmark contamination naturally occurs as AI systems becoming increasingly capable. Now, benchmarks are the absolute bedrock of systems engineering. And why does that matter so much to us? Well, because without a reliable compass, we're effectively flying blind. Imagine billions of dollars alongside years of painstaking research all being funneled into building a complex system, only for the creators to realize halfway through that their trajectory was completely off, simply because the compass itself was broken. That is what's truly at stake here. So what exactly happens when the test itself becomes the target of the system? Today, we're going strictly by the data to map out precisely how this phenomenon unfolds. Let's dive right into this foundational premise from our source material. A benchmark loses value when models learn the test instead of the problem. To really grasp the mechanics of this, think of a student preparing for a massive final exam. If that student simply memorizes the answer key to pass versions of the test, well, they're obviously going to score a perfect 100%. But if you ask them to apply that knowledge to a brand new real-world problem, they fail completely. You see, they learned the parameters of the test, not the underlying subject matter. And crucially, when we look at systems engineering, this isn't about malicious design or intentional cheating by researchers. Not at all. Rather, it's just a natural mathematical consequence of repeated optimization. When a system is continuously engineered to succeed, we have to look very closely at what exactly it is succeeding at. To deeply understand the mechanics of this contamination, we first need to establish the baseline of a perfectly healthy system, which is the independent evaluation. As defined here, an independent benchmark is a clean evaluation framework measuring genuine capability without being tied to the optimization process. You can think of it like a pristine measuring stick. But what actually makes a measuring stick pristine in this context? It comes down to zero prior exposure. For this framework to operate correctly, the system must never have seen the test data during its development phase. This absolute isolation is literally the only way to guarantee that our measurement is evaluating generalized intelligence and adaptable problem solving, rather than just rote memorization. If that stick is compromised, the entire measurement becomes theoretically invalid. So, in an ideal scenario, the progression is perfectly clean. First, the system encounters the test. Second, the clean, unseen benchmark is applied. And third, because the system had absolutely no prior exposure to the specific parameters of this test, a reliable, objective score is produced. Achieving this reliable score is really the gold standard of early AI development. When researchers see this clean score, it signifies something profound. It proves the system possesses genuine, generalized capability, meaning it can tackle problems it has never explicitly been trained for. It gives us a true, unvarnished reading of the system's baseline intelligence. But what happens when we introduce continuous development and actually feed those results back into the system? Because in the real world, researchers can't just test a model once, declare victory or defeat, and put it on a shelf. They are compelled to continuously refine it. And this brings us to a highly dynamic, iterative process, the optimization loop. We're moving away from a static, one-time measurement. And it's really important to emphasize the inevitability of this step. Researchers absolutely must iterate to make progress. So introducing this continuous loop isn't some deliberate failure or a methodological mistake. It is an unavoidable mathematical reality of how scientific progress fundamentally operates. Let's look at how this cyclical iteration actually operates. Training leads to testing. Testing leads to improvement, which then loops right back into training. On paper, this is standard scientific methodology, right? You build a model, you test it to find its weaknesses, and then you reach that critical improve step. During this phase, when a model fails a portion of the test, engineers don't simply shrug and move on. They meticulously analyze those specific failures. They adjust the underlying architecture, they tweak the training data, and they refine the parameters specifically to ensure the system does not fail in that exact same way twice. Then, they train it again. This is historically how all progress is made, but, as we'll see, it introduces a hidden vulnerability. And this brilliantly illustrates our systemic issue. With each successive optimization cycle, the benchmark is pulled increasingly closer to the training process itself. Think about how this cascades. Benchmark results feed back into model development. The new generations then optimize using those past results. Because the improvement phase is continually guided by the test results, that test data slowly, almost invisibly, leaks into the model's fundamental understanding. The strict barrier between the student and the exam begins to dissolve. Over successive cycles, the model's very architecture is shaped entirely by the specific contours of the benchmark. So the system isn't just getting smarter in a broad, general sense anymore, It's getting smarter specifically at answering the exact types of questions this one benchmark asks. Notice the subtle but profound structural shift happening here. Instead of measuring capability independently, the test has become part of what the system is actively optimizing for. The benchmark is no longer an outside objective observer. It has been fundamentally embedded right into the very fabric of the optimization loop. Think about the implications of this for a second. The measuring stick has essentially become a blueprint for the next iteration of the model. I love this conceptual metaphor. It's like you're no longer just measuring the structural integrity of a house. The ruler itself is actively telling the builders how to construct the walls. The evaluation tool has literally become the engineering target. So the absolutely crucial point here is the structural contrast between measuring actual intelligence versus simply engineering a system to pass the test. On one hand, we have independent measurement, which successfully captures genuine, generalized capability. But on the other, we have optimized measurement. Because the evaluation data has been cycled through the training process so many times, the system is now heavily incentivized to just output the exact patterns the test is looking for. And this creates a very powerful illusion of capability. The system looks incredibly smart on paper, but the moment it steps outside the laboratory and faces a novel, real-world problem that falls outside the narrow scope of its optimized test, that illusion collapses completely. This brings us to the core of benchmark contamination. The system posts higher and higher scores, but the benchmark itself has completely lost its objectivity. You can almost think of the benchmark at this stage as becoming blurred or fading in its utility. The model achieves increasingly higher scores, which certainly looks like exponential progress, but those scores no longer reflect genuine capability. And why does this matter so much? Because when benchmark contamination reaches this stage, a score of 99% doesn't mean the system is brilliant. It simply means the optimization loop has successfully completed its job. The numbers keep going up, but our trust in what those numbers actually represent is entirely eroded. Let's just take a moment to reflect on our journey so far, because this central academic thesis represents a massive paradigm shift in how we must view system evaluation. A benchmark measures intelligence only while it remains independent of optimization. We started with a clean, pristine measuring stick. Then, we watched as the totally necessary reality of continuous development drew that benchmark into the optimization loop. And finally, we saw that strict barrier dissolve until the benchmark became nothing more than a blueprint. A high score is completely meaningless if the system achieved it by memorizing the shape of the test rather than mastering the underlying domain. The independence of the benchmark is its only true source of value. Once that's compromised, the evaluation is contaminated. Moving forward, our focus really must radically evolve, because the true scientific hurdle is no longer chasing higher numbers, but ensuring our measurements remain untainted and credible. Now, this is incredibly difficult for an industry that is so accustomed to celebrating record-breaking scores. I mean, for years, hitting a higher benchmark number was the definitive proof of a scientific breakthrough. To suddenly have to accept that higher numbers no longer equate to genuine progress, that is a massive paradigm shift. Today, because systems are so exceptionally capable of adapting to whatever fixed targets we set for them, repeated optimization toward the exact same static benchmarks simply doesn't work anymore. The real scientific frontier right now is in preserving the integrity and the credibility of the evaluation framework itself. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final pivotal question. If we accept the mathematical reality that static benchmarks inevitably become contaminated through the optimization loop, well, what is the alternative? How do we measure capability when fixed tests fail? This question perfectly sets the stage for episode 25, where we'll be moving beyond benchmark reliability to tackle the broader, far more complex challenge of evaluating open-ended intelligence. We'll explore how we can establish frameworks that measure capability in a way that adapts, scales, and remains robust far beyond the limits of static, fixed testing. Thank you so much for joining me for this structural breakdown, and I really look forward to exploring that next frontier with you soon.